The Vatican archives contain a document that changed the course of European history for 1,000 years. The donation of Constantine is the greatest forgery of the Middle Ages, which gave popes power over kings and emperors. It was not until the 15th century that the humanist scholar Lorenzo Valla exposed this hoax using revolutionary methods of scientific analysis. Today, we will tell the story of the document that created and destroyed an entire era. Subscribe to the channel to learn about the greatest mysteries and hoaxes in history. And in the comments, discuss whether you think the Church had the right to use a forged document to achieve political goals if it contributed to the strengthening of Christian civilization. The Vatican archives contain a document that has determined the fate of kings and emperors in Europe for thousands of years. This parchment, covered with solemn Latin phrases, was allegedly written by Constantine the Great himself in the 4th century AD. According to the text, the first Christian emperor transferred not only spiritual, but also secular power over the entire Western Roman Empire to the Pope. But what if this greatest gift in the history of Christianity turned out to be the greatest forgery? The donation of Constantine, or Donatio Constantini, as medieval chroniclers called it, became the basis for papal claims to power over the monarchs of Europe. Relying on this document, popes crowned emperors, deposed kings, and declared crusades. Entire states changed their borders based on the provisions of this ancient charter. For 1,000 years, no one dared to question its authenticity. The true nature of the document was only revealed in the 15th century by the Italian humanist Lorenzo Valla. His philological analysis showed that the text contained anachronisms that could not be explained if it was dated to the 4th century. The language of the document, the terms used, even the handwriting, everything pointed to the fact that researchers were looking at a skillful forgery created in the 8th century. Valla's discovery came as a real shock to the medieval world. It turned out that for 7 centuries, European politics had been built on a false foundation. Kings bowed down before popes, citing the will of Constantine, which never existed. The emperors of the Holy Roman Empire received their crowns from the hands of the pontiff, believing in a legitimacy based on a forgery. How did one forged document manage to change the course of history? And why did it take 1,000 years to expose this hoax? The story of Constantine's donation is not only a tale of a brilliant forgery, but also a narrative of how the desire for power can make people believe any lie if it serves the necessary goals. To understand the scale of this historical hoax, we need to immerse ourselves in the era of early Christianity and trace the document's path from its creation to its triumphant exposure. Each stage of this story reveals new facets of medieval politics, church diplomacy, and the nascent humanistic sciences. The document we know today as the donation of Constantine is first mentioned in sources from the 8th century. It was at this time that the papacy needed compelling arguments to justify its claims to secular dominion. The Lombards threatened papal possessions. The Byzantine emperors claimed control over Rome, and the Frankish kings were becoming increasingly powerful allies of the Church. The appearance of such a convenient document at the right moment in history should have aroused suspicion in itself. However, medieval society, where literacy was rare and critical analysis of texts was not developed, accepted the donation as an indisputable historical fact. After all, who would dare to question the word of Constantine the Great, the emperor equal to the apostles? To understand the full depth of the mystification of Constantine's donation, it is necessary to turn to the personality of the emperor himself, in whose name the document was signed. Gaius Flavius Valerius Constantine, who went down in history as Constantine the Great, ruled the Roman Empire from 306 to 337 AD. His reign was a turning point, not only for Rome, but for the entire Christian world. Constantine was born into the family of the military commander Constantius Chlorus, around 270 in the city of Nisus, in what is now Serbia. From his youth, he showed outstanding abilities as a commander and politician. After his father's death in 306, Constantine was proclaimed Augustus by the troops in Britain, beginning a long struggle for sole power in the empire. But what made the battle-hardened emperor, raised in the traditions of Roman paganism, turn to a new religion? The answer to this question lies in the famous battle at the Milvian Bridge in 312. According to church sources, it was before this battle that Constantine saw a cross in the sky with the inscription, "In this sign thou shalt conquer," and decided to make Christianity the religion of his army. Modern historians treat this story with a certain degree of skepticism, pointing to the gradual nature of religious changes under Constantine. Most likely, the emperor was guided not only by mystical experiences, but also by pragmatic considerations. By the beginning of the 4th century, Christianity had spread to a significant part of the empire's population, especially in the eastern provinces and large cities. The Edict of Milan of 313 was the first official document proclaiming religious tolerance in the Roman Empire. Constantine and his co-ruler Licinius announced the end of the persecution of Christians and the return of their confiscated property. This was a revolutionary step, reversing the policies of previous emperors. However, Constantine never made Christianity the state religion. This step would only be taken by Theodosius I at the end of the 4th century. Moreover, the emperor himself was baptized only on his deathbed in 337. Until that moment, he remained a catechumen, a convert preparing to receive the sacrament. Could such a pragmatic politician really have transferred power over half of the empire to the Pope? An analysis of the actions of the historical Constantine shows that this is highly unlikely. Throughout his life, the emperor zealously guarded the prerogatives of imperial power and never allowed church hierarchs to interfere in state affairs. Moreover, during Constantine's time, the Pope did not yet have the authority that he would acquire in subsequent centuries. The Church was organized according to the principle of pentarchy, or 5 powers, where the Bishop of Rome was considered only first among equals, along with the Patriarchs of Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. The idea of papal primacy over the entire Church was still a distant prospect. Constantine did actively intervene in church affairs, but as an arbitrator and defender, not as a subordinate to church authority. He convened councils, appointed bishops, and even intervened in dogmatic disputes. The famous First Council of Nicaea in 325 was convened precisely on the initiative of the emperor to resolve the Arian controversy. If the historical Constantine never transferred power to the Pope, when and why did a document appear that claimed the opposite? The answer to this question requires a look at the political realities of the 8th century, when the papacy found itself between the hammer and the anvil of various political forces. The birth of the legend of Constantine's donation is inextricably linked to the political upheavals of the 8th century, when the papacy found itself in an extremely difficult position. From the north of Italy, the Lombards threatened to capture Rome and subjugate the papal possessions. From the east, pressure was exerted by the Byzantine Empire, where iconoclastic emperors claimed control over the Western Church. In these circumstances, the popes needed compelling arguments to justify their independence and secular power. The first written mention of Constantine's donation appears in the middle of the 8th century in the correspondence between Pope Stephen II and the Frankish king Pepin the Short. The pontiff appealed to the Frankish ruler for military assistance against the Lombards, referring to the ancient rights of the Church, allegedly granted by Constantine the Great himself. But was it not too convenient for such a document to appear at the very moment when it was most needed for papal diplomacy? The political situation of the 8th century required the papacy to actively seek new allies. The Byzantine emperors, nominally considered defenders of Rome, were in practice increasingly becoming opponents of the Western Church. The iconoclastic policy of Leo III Isauer and his successors put the papacy in opposition to Constantinople. In 752, the Lombard king Aistulf captured Ravenna, the center of Byzantine administration in Italy. This meant that the formal authority of the Eastern emperors over the papal possessions had come to an end. The Lombards threatened Rome itself, demanding obedience and tribute from the Pope. In these critical circumstances, Pope Stephen II decided to seek the protection of the Frankish kings. What arguments could convince the Frankish king to intervene in Italian affairs and oppose the Lombards? Simple appeals for help were unlikely to make the desired impression on the pragmatic Pepin the Short. Strong legal grounds were needed to justify Frankish intervention in Italian politics. It was at this point that the reference to Constantine's donation appeared. According to the papal version of events, the first Christian emperor allegedly transferred to the Roman bishop not only spiritual authority over the Western Church, but also secular dominion over the entire Western Roman Empire. Thus, the Lombard invasion was seen not simply as military aggression, but as an encroachment on the sacred rights granted by Constantine the Great himself. The Franco-Papal alliance, concluded as a result of these negotiations, became a turning point in European history. Pepin the Short crossed the Alps twice to defend the papal possessions, and his son, Charlemagne, completed the destruction of the Lombard kingdom. In gratitude for this help, Pope Stephen anointed Pepin as king, legitimizing the power of the new Carolingian dynasty. But what role did the mysterious document attributed to Constantine play in these events? Modern researchers point out that correspondence from the mid-8th century contains only brief references to the rights of the Church granted by ancient emperors. The full text of the donation appears in sources only in the 9th century. It is most likely that initially there were only general ideas about Constantine's beneficence towards the Church. These ideas were based on real historical facts: the Edict of Milan, the construction of churches, and the emperor's participation in church councils. Gradually, these scattered pieces of information turned into a coherent legend about the emperor's transfer of secular power to the Pope. The scribes of the papal chancellery played a key role in shaping this legend, actively working in the 8th and 9th centuries to create documentary evidence for the papal claims. It is among these anonymous medieval forgers that we must seek the true author of Constantine's donation. The creation of a forged document in the Middle Ages was not considered reprehensible if it served a good purpose. Medieval chroniclers regularly improved historical sources by adding missing details or clarifications. In the view of that time, it was not literal accuracy that was important, but the conveyance of the essence of the events that took place. The text of Constantine's donation that has survived to this day is a lengthy document written in solemn Latin and replete with pompous phrases. According to this text, Emperor Constantine the Great, healed of leprosy by Pope Sylvester I, in gratitude for his miraculous recovery, transfers power over the entire Western Roman Empire to the Roman bishop and his successors. The document begins with a lengthy introduction in which Constantine professes the Christian faith and recounts his conversion. According to the donation, the emperor fell ill with leprosy, and pagan priests suggested that he bathe in the blood of innocent infants to be healed. Constantine, allegedly moved by the tears of the mothers, refused this cruel treatment, for which he was rewarded with the appearance of the apostles Peter and Paul in a dream. But does this version of events correspond to what we know about the real Constantine from reliable historical sources? No contemporary author mentions the emperor's leprosy. Eusebius of Caesarea, Constantine's court historian and biographer, describes the emperor's conversion in detail, but links it to a vision before the battle at the Milvian Bridge, not to a miraculous healing. According to the text of the donation, Pope Sylvester baptized Constantine in the Lateran baptistry, after which the emperor was immediately healed of leprosy. In gratitude for this miracle, Constantine allegedly decided to grant the Pope enormous privileges and territories. However, the historical Constantine was baptized only before his death in 337 by Bishop Eusebius of Nicomedia, who also held Arian views. The main part of the document contains a list of gifts that the emperor allegedly gave to the Pope. First and foremost, this is spiritual authority over all the churches of the world, including the patriarchates of Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Constantine recognizes the Pope as the vicar of the Son of God and the head of the entire church, which directly contradicts the historical realities of the 4th century. Next comes the transfer of secular powers. Constantine supposedly gives the Pope the imperial crown, scepter, and all other signs of imperial dignity. Moreover, he transfers to the pontiff authority over all the provinces, cities, and regions of the Western Roman Empire, retaining for himself only the administration of the eastern territories. Could the real Constantine have committed such an unprecedented act of transferring power? An analysis of the emperor's policies shows that this is highly unlikely. Constantine spent his entire life strengthening imperial power and creating a new administrative system. He founded Constantinople as New Rome, intending to make it the center of the Christian empire. The idea of transferring half of the empire to a church hierarch contradicted all his political aspirations. The geographical references in the text of the donation also raise serious doubts. The document mentions islands in the western part of the empire, which is strange for a 4th century text. In addition, the document uses the term satrapy, which was no longer used in Roman administrative practice at that time. The language of the document is replete with anachronisms characteristic of the 8th and 9th centuries. The terminology used, stylistic turns of phrase, and even paleographic features indicate a much later date of creation. The medieval forger was unable to completely hide the traces of his era in the text attributed to the 4th century. The final part of the document, where Constantine allegedly explains his decision to move the capital to the east by his desire not to compete with papal power in Rome, looks particularly suspicious. This explanation looks like a retroactive justification, created to explain why the emperor, who had transferred power over the West to the Pope, continued to rule from Constantinople. An analysis of the content of Constantine's donation shows that this is not an authentic 4th century document, but a skillful stylization created several centuries later to justify the papal claims to secular power. But how did this forged text manage to deceive entire generations of medieval rulers and scholars? The transformation of Constantine's donation from a little-known text into a fundamental document of medieval politics did not happen overnight. It took centuries for the forged charter to acquire the status of indisputable historical truth and become the cornerstone of papal claims to secular power. This process reflects the peculiarities of the medieval attitude towards written sources and methods of verifying them. In the 9th century, Constantine's donation was included in the collection of ecclesiastical law Pseudo-Isidore's Decretals, compiled in the Frankish Empire. This document, also a forgery, contained many fake papal decrees designed to justify the independence of the Church from secular power. The inclusion of the donation in this authoritative legal collection significantly increased its status and circulation. How did medieval scholars and rulers treat documents claiming to be ancient? In conditions of limited literacy and the absence of developed methods of textual analysis, the authenticity of a document was determined primarily by its conformity with existing ideas and political needs. If a document confirmed already established beliefs, its authenticity was rarely questioned. Church chroniclers of the 10th and 11th centuries actively used Constantine's donation in their writings, presenting it as an indisputable historical fact. The annalist Liutprand of Cremona, Adam of Bremen, Thietmar of Merseburg, and other authoritative historians of the time referred to the document without expressing any doubts about its authenticity. The political situation also contributed to the spread of belief in the authenticity of the donation. The papacy was undergoing a period of strengthening its position after the crisis of the 10th century, known as the pornocracy. The Gregorian reforms of the 11th century required a powerful ideological justification for the papacy's claims to independence from secular power. Why did even educated people of that time fail to notice the obvious anachronisms in the text of the donation? Medieval education was based on the study of ancient authors and church fathers, but critical analysis of sources was not part of the university curriculum. Philology as a science was still a distant prospect, and methods for determining the authenticity of texts remained primitive. Moreover, the very idea of systematic forgery seemed unlikely to medieval people. In their view, falsifying a sacred document would be unthinkable sacrilege, which would inevitably bring God's punishment. This naive belief in the honesty of their ancestors paradoxically made the task of forgers easier. Canonists, specialists in ecclesiastical law, played a special role in legitimizing the donation. The inclusion of the document in official legal compilations gave it the status of indisputable truth. The Decretum Gratiani, created in the 12th century and which became the basis of medieval canon law, contained extensive excerpts from Constantine's donation. How was the donation used in medieval political practice? Popes regularly referred to this document in diplomatic correspondence, justifying their claims to supremacy over secular rulers. The donation was used particularly actively during conflicts with the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. Gregory VII, in his famous struggle with Emperor Henry IV, repeatedly referred to the rights granted to the Church by Constantine. Innocent III used the donation to justify his claims to suzerainty over the European kingdoms. Boniface VIII also relied on this document in his bull Unam Sanctam. Secular rulers, as a rule, did not dispute the authenticity of the donation, but offered alternative interpretations of its content. They argued that Constantine could only transfer to the Pope the rights that he himself possessed, or that subsequent emperors had the right to revoke the decisions of their predecessor. Thus, Constantine's donation became not just a historical document, but a living instrument of medieval politics. For 7 centuries, this forged text determined the relationship between ecclesiastical and secular power in Europe, influencing the fate of kingdoms and empires. Its exposure required revolutionary changes in the methods of studying historical sources. The donation of Constantine became a powerful weapon in the arsenal of the medieval papacy, allowing pontiffs to claim supremacy over all Christian rulers in Europe. Relying on this document, the popes not only defended their independence from secular power, but also actively interfered in the affairs of kingdoms, deposed unwelcome monarchs, and redrew the political map of the continent. The first pope to fully exploit the possibilities of the donation was Gregory VII, whose pontificate fell in the 11th century. This outstanding church figure, whose secular name was Hildebrand, turned the papacy into a powerful political force, capable of dictating its will to emperors and kings. But at what cost did the papacy gain this power? The conflict between Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV became a classic example of the use of Constantine's donation in political struggle. The dispute began over the right to appoint bishops, investiture. The emperor considered himself entitled to appoint church hierarchs in his domains, citing ancient traditions. The pope, relying on the donation, claimed that all spiritual offices were within his exclusive competence. In 766, Gregory VII issued his famous decree against simony and secular investiture. Henry IV responded by deposing the Pope at the Synod of Worms. The pontiff then took the extreme measure of excommunicating the emperor from the church and releasing his subjects from their oath of allegiance. This unprecedented action was made possible only by the authority of Constantine's donation. The results were not long in coming. Taking advantage of the situation, the German princes rebelled against the emperor. Henry IV found himself completely isolated and was forced to seek reconciliation with the Pope. The famous Walk to Canossa in 1077, when the emperor stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days in front of the castle where the Pope was staying, became a symbol of the triumph of ecclesiastical power over secular power. Gregory VII's successors continued his policy of active intervention in the affairs of European states. Pope Innocent III, who ruled at the turn of the 12th and 13th centuries, brought the theory of papal supremacy to its logical conclusion. He declared himself the Vicar of Christ and demanded that all Christian rulers recognize his suzerainty. How was Constantine's donation used to justify the Crusades? The popes claimed that the liberation of the Holy Land was their direct responsibility as successors to imperial power in the West. Urban II, proclaiming the First Crusade in 1095, referred to the rights granted to the Church by Constantine the Great. The successes of the Crusaders in Syria and Palestine were seen as confirmation of divine approval of papal policy. The creation of Crusader states under the authority of the Pope seemed to be a practical implementation of the principles laid down in Constantine's donation. The Church received real territories ruled by its protégés. The donation was used particularly actively in resolving disputes over succession to the throne. The popes assumed the right to decide which of the pretenders was worthy of the throne, referring to the imperial prerogatives transferred to them by Constantine. A classic example was the dispute over the English throne between Stephen of Blois and Empress Matilda in the 12th century. The donation played an equally important role in the papacy's relations with the Byzantine Empire. The patriarchs of Constantinople categorically rejected the claims of the Roman popes to supremacy in the Church. However, the popes referred to the donation as proof that the founder of the Eastern capital himself recognized the primacy of the Roman bishop. Gradually, Constantine's donation became the foundation of the entire system of papal power in medieval Europe. No serious political document of that time was complete without references to this historical precedent. Kings and emperors could argue with specific decisions of the popes, but few dared to question the authenticity of the donation itself. However, the more important this document became in European politics, the more people began to question its authenticity. The first doubts arose as early as the 12th century, when some scholars noticed oddities in the text of the donation. The creation of the Holy Roman Empire in the 9th century was a direct result of the ideology laid down in Constantine's donation. When Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne with the imperial crown in Rome in 800, he effectively implemented the principle that only the Roman pontiff had the right to transfer imperial power in the West. This moment became a turning point in European history and defined the relationship between ecclesiastical and secular power for a long time. But was Charlemagne's coronation really based on Constantine's donation? Modern researchers point out that direct references to this document are rare in sources from the 8th and 9th centuries. However, the very idea that the Pope has the right to transfer imperial power clearly echoes the content of the donation. Frankish annalists describe the coronation as a surprise for Charlemagne himself. Einhard, the emperor's biographer, claims that the king of the Franks was unaware of the Pope's intentions and was taken aback by the ceremony. However, the political realities of the time suggest otherwise. The coronation was a carefully planned event designed to legitimize the new empire in the West. The creation of the Western Empire solved several problems of papal policy at once. First, it freed the pontiff from dependence on the Byzantine emperors, who nominally continued to consider Rome part of their possessions. Second, it gave the papacy a powerful defender against the Lombards and other threats. Third, it affirmed the principle of papal supremacy in matters of legitimacy of power. Why was Charlemagne chosen as the new emperor? By the end of the 8th century, the Frankish king had become the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. His victories over the Lombards, Saxons, and Avars significantly expanded the borders of the Christian world. In addition, Charlemagne actively supported church reform and missionary activity. The coronation in St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome was held with the utmost solemnity. According to the chronicles, Pope Leo III placed the crown on Charlemagne's head during Christmas Mass, after which the Roman people exclaimed 3 times, "To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, the great and peaceful Emperor of the Romans, life and victory. What was the significance of this phrase? The title, Emperor of the Romans, directly referred to the ancient tradition, but with an important addition: crowned by God. This emphasized that the new imperial power was of divine origin and had been transferred through the mediation of the Pope. Thus, Constantine's gift was given practical expression. Byzantium's reaction to the creation of the Western Empire was predictably negative. The emperors of Constantinople viewed Charlemagne's coronation as usurpation and a violation of the principle of the unity of the Roman Empire. Diplomatic negotiations between the East and the West continued for several years before the Byzantines agreed to recognize Charlemagne's imperial title. Charlemagne's successors faced the problem of legitimizing their power. After the collapse of the Carolingian Empire in the 9th century, the imperial title became the subject of fierce struggle between various dynasties, and each time, the decisive word remained with the Pope, who referred to the rights granted to him by Constantine. The revival of the Holy Roman Empire under Otto I in the 10th century once again demonstrated the key role of Constantine's gift in European politics. The German king was crowned in Rome by Pope John XII in 962, marking the beginning of a centuries-long alliance between German kings and Roman pontiffs. However, this alliance was far from harmonious. Constant conflicts between emperors and popes over the boundaries of their powers became a characteristic feature of medieval politics. Constantine's donations served as a weapon in this struggle, with each side interpreting the document in its own favor. The emperors claimed that Constantine had transferred only spiritual power to the Pope, retaining for himself and his successors the right to secular rule. The popes, on the other hand, insisted on a literal interpretation of the donation, according to which they possessed full power in the West. These disputes continued until the document was exposed as a forgery in the 15th century. The Crusades became one of the most significant manifestations of papal power, based on Constantine's donation. The pontiffs viewed the liberation of the Holy Land not simply as a religious war, but as the restoration of the Christian Church's legitimate rights to territories that had once belonged to the Roman Empire. Constantine's donation gave the popes legal justification for mobilizing all the resources of Western Christianity for this grand purpose. Urban II, proclaiming the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont in 1095, directly referred to the imperial rights transferred to the Church by Constantine the Great. According to the Pope, the Muslim conquest of the eastern provinces of the former Roman Empire was an illegal encroachment on Christian territories. Consequently, the war for their liberation was not an act of aggression, but a restoration of justice. How did Constantine's donation influence the organization of the Crusades? The popes used this document to justify their right to declare holy war, mobilize armies, and distribute land holdings in the conquered territories. Urban II's bull, Terra Sancta, explicitly stated that the liberation of Jerusalem was the fulfillment of Constantine the Great's own will. The success of the First Crusade seemed to confirm divine approval of papal policy. The capture of Jerusalem in 1099 and the creation of the Crusader states were seen as the practical implementation of the principles of the donation. Papal legates in the East acted as representatives of the supreme authority, relying on the authority of Constantine's document. The role of donation was particularly evident in the creation of military monastic orders. The Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Order received extensive privileges from the popes, which were justified by references to the rights of the Church granted by the first Christian emperor. These orders became a kind of state within a state, directly subordinate to the Pope. Why did secular rulers agree to participate in the Crusades if this strengthened the position of the papacy? The motives of the participants were varied: religious zeal, thirst for adventure, desire for enrichment, political considerations. Many hoped to gain territorial acquisitions in the East that would be free from obligations to European suzerains. The donation of Constantine served as the legal basis for the territorial structure of the Crusader states. The Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the County of Tripoli were formally considered fiefs of the Pope as heir to imperial power in the East. Thus, a forged document from the 4th century determined the political geography of the 12th century. The failures of subsequent crusades led some contemporaries to question the legitimacy of these wars. The loss of Jerusalem in 1187 was a particularly painful blow. Critics began to say that God did not bless the Crusades, which called into question the legitimacy of the papal claims. The Fourth Crusade, which ended with the capture of Constantinople in 1204, demonstrated how Constantine's gift could be used against the Byzantine Empire itself. The popes viewed the capture of the eastern capital as the return of territories that had rightfully belonged to the Western Church since the time of Constantine. The creation of the Latin Empire in Constantinople was the culmination of a policy based on Constantine's donation. For the first time since ancient times, the eastern capital was under the control of a Western ruler, formally subordinate to the Pope. This seemed to be the final triumph of the principles laid down in the legendary document. However, the restoration of the Byzantine Empire in 1261 showed the transience of these achievements. Real politics proved stronger than documentary evidence, even if it was based on the authority of Constantine the Great himself. It gradually became clear that references to ancient rites alone were not enough to maintain power over vast territories. The decline of the Crusades coincided with the first serious doubts about the authenticity of Constantine's donation. Scholars began to pay attention to contradictions in the text of the document and the inconsistency of its content with the historical realities of the 4th century. The confrontation between the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire and the papal authority became one of the central themes of medieval European history. Constantine's donation played a key role in this conflict, serving as the main argument of the papal side in justifying its supremacy over secular rulers. However, the emperors did not remain passive observers and developed their own strategies to counter the papal claims. Frederick I Barbarossa, who ruled in the 12th century, became one of the most consistent opponents of papal supremacy. This outstanding emperor not only rejected the political claims of the pontiffs, but also put forward an alternative theory of the origin of imperial power. According to his views, emperors received their power directly from God, not through the mediation of the Pope. How did Barbarossa counter arguments based on Constantine's donation? The emperor and his lawyers developed the theory of transfer of the empire, translatio imperii, according to which imperial power passed from one people to another by the will of providence. The Roman Empire was transferred from the Romans to the Germans, and this transfer did not require papal mediation. The conflict reached its peak during Frederick Barbarossa's Italian campaigns. The emperor claimed real control over the northern Italian cities, considering them part of his hereditary possessions. The Pope, referring to Constantine's donation, claimed that all of Italy was under his supremacy, and that the emperor could only rule it as a papal vassal. The conflict with Pope Alexander III was particularly dramatic. The pontiff not only refused to recognize the imperial rights to Italian territories, but also supported the Lombard cities in their struggle against the emperor. The Battle of Legnano in 1176, where the imperial troops were defeated by the Lombard League, became a symbolic triumph of papal policy. What role did Constantine's donation play in these events? Pope Alexander III regularly referred to this document in his bulls addressed to the emperor. He claimed that Frederick was violating the will of Constantine the Great himself by attempting to restore imperial power in Italy. The donation was presented as an irrevocable act of transferring secular powers to the Church. The imperial side's response was no less well argued. Barbarossa's lawyers pointed out that even if the donation was genuine, Constantine could not transfer what he did not possess himself. Roman emperors were never owners of the empire, but only its administrators. Consequently, Constantine had no right to give the empire to anyone. This argument touched on a fundamental problem of medieval political theory. What was imperial power? The personal property of the ruler, or a public service? The entire system of relations between ecclesiastical and secular power depended on the answer to this question. Barbarossa's successor, Frederick II, brought the conflict with the papacy to an extreme. This outstanding emperor, nicknamed Stupor Mundi, wonder of the world, not only rejected the papal claims, but also criticized the very principle of ecclesiastical interference in secular affairs. His struggle with Popes Honorius III, Gregory IX, and Innocent IV lasted for decades. Frederick II was the first emperor to openly question the authenticity of Constantine's donation. In his letters, he pointed out anachronisms in the text of the document and emphasized that the historical Constantine never performed such a grandioso acto de transferir poder. This criticism foreshadowed the future scientific exposure of the forgery. The papal reaction to the criticism was predictably harsh. Innocent IV not only excommunicated Frederick II from the church, but also declared him deposed, freeing his subjects from their oath of allegiance. Constantine's donation again served as the main justification for the Pope's actions. The pontiff claimed that an emperor who denied the rights of the church was automatically deprived of his powers. The death of Frederick II in 1250 ended the great era of confrontation between the empire and the papacy. However, disputes over Constantine's donation continued, taking on an increasingly scholarly form. The first systematic studies of this mysterious document began at the universities of Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. The first serious doubts about the authenticity of Constantine's donation arose in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, when the development of university education and scholastic thought contributed to a more critical approach to historical sources. Legal scholars studying Roman law at the universities of Bologna and Paris began to notice contradictions between the content of the donation and reliable information about the era of Constantine the Great. What made medieval intellectuals doubt a document that had been considered irrefutable proof of papal rights for centuries? The main role was played by a revival of interest in ancient history and the development of a comparative method of studying sources. University masters gained access to the works of Eusebius of Caesarea, Lactantius, and other authors who lived during the time of Constantine. Arnold of Brescia, a famous religious reformer of the 12th century, was one of the first to publicly question the historical authenticity of the donation. In his sermons, he pointed out the discrepancy between the image of Constantine in the donation and what is known about him from reliable sources. How could the emperor who founded Constantinople as the second capital of the empire simultaneously transfer power over the West to the Roman bishop? Arnold's criticism was based not only on historical arguments, but also on theological considerations. He argued that the church should not have secular power, as this contradicts the teachings of Christ. Consequently, even if the donation was genuine, its content could not be considered binding on Christians. This argument anticipated future Reformation ideas. The Waldensians, a religious movement that arose in Lyon at the end of the 12th century, also expressed skepticism about Constantine's donation. The movement's founder, Peter Waldo, and his followers preached a return to evangelical simplicity and the Church's renunciation of secular possessions. They viewed the donation as a symbol of the Church's fall, its departure from true Christian ideals. Teachers at the University of Bologna, a center for the study of canon and Roman law, played a particularly important role in criticizing the donation. 12th century glossators, commenting on the texts of the Justinian Code, drew attention to the absence in Roman law of any mention of the emperor's transfer of secular power to the Pope. If the donation had indeed taken place, why did all the legal sources of the era remain silent about it? Irenaeus Gratian, compiler of the famous Decretum, a fundamental collection of canon law, included the text of the donation in his work, but accompanied it with cautious comments. He pointed out the need to distinguish between spiritual and secular power, emphasizing that even Constantine's donation could not serve as a basis for unlimited papal interference in the affairs of states. What was the reaction to these first doubts in church circles? The papal curia responded to the criticism by intensifying its propaganda of the donation and creating new interpretations of it. Detailed commentaries on the text were compiled to explain all apparent contradictions. Papal legists developed the theory of the hidden donation, according to which Constantine could have transferred power to the Church unofficially, which explained the lack of mention of this by his contemporaries. Innocent III, one of the most powerful popes of the Middle Ages, devoted several bulls to defending the authenticity of the donation. He declared doubts about this document to be a manifestation of heresy that threatened the foundations of the Christian order. The pontiff argued that denying the donation was tantamount to denying the divine nature of papal power. Paradoxically, the papal curia's vigorous defense of the donation only reinforced the suspicions of critically minded intellectuals. If the document was indeed authentic, why was such effort needed to prove its authenticity? Wasn't the very need for defense an admission of the weakness of the defender's position? Thomas Aquinas cautiously touched on the issue of the donation in his works, avoiding categorical statements about its authenticity. The great scholastic recognized the historical possibility of such an act on the part of Constantine, but emphasized that the secular power of the Pope must first and foremost have a spiritual justification, rather than relying solely on historical precedent. In his treatise, Monarchy, Dante Alighieri expressed the revolutionary idea for his time that Constantine's donation, even if authentic, had no legal force. According to the great poet, the emperor could not transfer what he had no right to dispose of. The empire belongs not to the emperor, but to all of humanity, and no one has the right to alienate it. By the beginning of the 14th century, an influential movement had formed in European intellectual circles that questioned not only the political significance of Constantine's donation, but also its historical authenticity. These doubts paved the way for the future scientific exposure of one of the greatest forgeries in human history. Lorenzo Valla went down in history as the man who dealt a fatal blow to one of the greatest hoaxes of the Middle Ages. This Italian humanist, who lived in the 15th century, applied revolutionary methods of philological analysis to the study of Constantine's donation and irrefutably proved its falsity. His treatise, On the False Understanding and False Donation of Constantine, became a turning point not only in the history of the study of this document, but also in the development of critical historical science. Who was this man who dared to challenge a 1,000-year-old tradition? Lorenzo Valla was born in Rome around 1407 into a family of lawyers. Having received a brilliant education in classical philology, he became one of the leading representatives of Italian humanism. Valla was fluent in Latin and Greek, which allowed him to conduct the most subtle analysis of ancient texts. Valla's career was closely linked to the political upheavals of the 15th century. He served as secretary to King Alfonso of Naples, who was in conflict with Pope Eugene IV over territorial disputes in Italy. It was this political situation that gave Valla the opportunity and incentive to critically examine the donation of Constantine. King Alfonso was interested in undermining the ideological foundations of papal power, as the pontiffs used the donation to justify their claims to southern Italy. Valla received royal patronage for his research, which protected him from possible persecution by the church authorities. Without this protection, his revolutionary work would hardly have seen the light of day. Valla's treatise was written around 1440. But its publication was delayed due to the political situation. The full text of the work became widely known only in the second half of the 15th century, when the humanist movement reached maturity and methods of critical analysis of texts gained recognition in academic circles. What methods did Valla use to prove the forgery of the donation? His approach was innovative for its time and laid the foundations for modern textual criticism. Valla applied philological analysis, historical method, and logical criticism, creating a comprehensive system of evidence for the document's falsity. Philological analysis formed the basis of the study. Valla showed that the language of the donation contains many words and expressions that were not used in the 4th century, but were characteristic of the 8th and 9th centuries. He drew attention to the use of the word satrapy instead of province, and the use of the terms feudum, fief, and beneficium, benefice, which only appeared in the early Middle Ages. The analysis of the titles was particularly convincing. Valla showed that in the donation, the Pope is referred to by titles that did not exist in the 4th century. The term Pope, in the sense of the exclusive title of the Roman bishop, was only established in the 11th century. In Constantine's era, this word was used to refer to all bishops without distinction. Historical analysis revealed glaring anachronisms in the text of the donation. Valla pointed to references to cities and territories that did not exist or did not belong to Rome in Constantine's time. He showed that the geographical ideas of the author of the donation corresponded not to the 4th century, but to the 8th or 9th centuries. Logical criticism was directed against the very content of the document. Valla wondered, could a rational politician like Constantine have committed such an irrational act of transferring half of the empire? Why are all contemporary historians silent about this momentous event? How can we explain that Constantine, who allegedly gave the West to the Pope, continued to actively rule the Western provinces until his death? Valla also criticized the story of Constantine's leprosy and his healing by Pope Sylvester. He showed that this legend has no basis in reliable sources and was created much later to justify the donation. The real Constantine never had leprosy and was baptized by a completely different bishop in different circumstances. The revolutionary nature of Valla's approach lay not only in his specific conclusions, but also in his research method itself. He was the first to apply the same criteria of authenticity to a medieval document that had been used to study ancient texts. This marked the birth of a new discipline, critical diplomatics, which studies the authenticity of historical documents. The philological evidence of forgery presented by Lorenzo Valla in his treatise became a model for the scientific analysis of historical sources. The Italian humanist methodically analyzed the text of Constantine's donation, revealing numerous linguistic, stylistic, and content-related anachronisms that irrefutably prove that the document was created not in the 4th, but in the 8th or 9th centuries AD. What was the Latin of Constantine's donation like from the point of view of a professional philologist? Valla showed that the language of the document was radically different from the classical Latin of the late Empire. The author of the donation used grammatical constructions, vocabulary, and syntax characteristic of the early Middle Ages. This was especially noticeable when compared to authentic documents from the 4th century. Lexical analysis revealed many words that simply did not exist in Constantine's time. The term satrapy, to denote a province, fell out of use during the Principate and was never used in official documents of the late Empire. The words feud, feudum, and benefice, beneficium, in the sense in which they are used in the donation, only appeared in the Carolingian era. The use of ecclesiastical terminology was particularly revealing. Valla pointed out that in the donation, the Pope is referred to as Vicar of the Son of God, a title that only appeared in medieval theology. In the 4th century, Roman bishops did not claim such a high status and used more modest titles. Stylistic analysis also confirmed the later origin of the document. Valla showed that the syntax of the deed is characteristic of medieval Latin, with its complex periods, abundance of subordinate clauses, and rhetorical figures, which are not typical of official documents of late antiquity. The author of the donation clearly imitated the style of imperial letters, but did so from the perspective of an 8th to 9th century person. Content analysis revealed glaring historical errors. Valla pointed to the mention in the text of Constantinople as an already existing city at the time of the donation. However, according to the document itself, The decision to establish a new capital was made by the emperor after the transfer of power to the Pope, as compensation for the loss of dominion over the West. The geographical ideas of the author of the deed also betrayed its later origin. The document mentioned territories and administrative units that did not exist in the 4th century. Particularly telling was the mention of islands in the western part of the empire, a term that came into use only after the Arab conquest of the Mediterranean. Valla drew attention to the anachronisms in the description of the ceremony and the imperial regalia. The donation describes in detail the transfer of the crown, scepter, and other signs of imperial dignity to the Pope, and these regalia are described in terms of medieval symbols of power. The actual imperial insignia of the 4th century differed significantly from their medieval counterparts. What role did the analysis of the document's handwriting and material characteristics play in proving its forgery? Valla pointed out that the surviving manuscripts of the donation are written in Carolingian minuscule, a type of script that only appeared in the 8th and 9th centuries. There are no copies of the document written in uncial or semi-uncial script, types of writing characteristic of late antiquity. Formular analysis also confirmed the conclusions about the forgery. Valla showed that the structure of the donation did not correspond to the canons of imperial acts of the late empire. The document was composed according to the models of papal letters from the 8th and 9th centuries, which revealed its origin in the church chancelleries of that time. A comparative analysis with authentic documents from the era of Constantine was particularly convincing. Valla compared the language and style of the donation with the Edict of Milan and other authentic acts of the first Christian emperor. The differences were so striking that there was no doubt about the different origins of these texts. Valla's philological criticism was not limited to technical details. He showed that the whole concept of the donation contradicted the political practice and legal ideas of the late empire. Roman emperors never considered the empire to be their personal property, which they could give away at their discretion. The method developed by Valla had a revolutionary impact on the development of historical science. For the first time, a comprehensive approach to source criticism was applied, combining philological, historical, and logical analysis. This approach formed the basis of modern diplomatics, the science of the authenticity and interpretation of historical documents. The Catholic Church's reaction to the exposure of Constantine's donation was complex and ambiguous. The initial attempt to silence Valla's work was replaced by a defensive strategy, and then a gradual recognition of its scientific value. This process took several centuries and reflected the slow transformation of the Church's attitude toward historical sources and the scientific methods of studying them. How did the Church authorities react to the first appearance of Valla's treatise? Initially, the papal curia tried to silence the dangerous research. The treatise, On the False Understanding and False Donation of Constantine, was included in the Index of Prohibited Books, and reading it was punishable by excommunication from the Church. Church censors confiscated manuscripts from libraries in an attempt to limit the spread of heretical ideas. However, the Renaissance contributed to the rapid spread of humanistic ideas. Valla's work was copied in numerous manuscripts and passed from hand to hand among the educated people of Europe. The invention of printing made the Church's attempts at censorship even less effective. Scientific truth proved stronger than administrative prohibitions. Some progressive church leaders recognized the validity of Valla's criticism, but offered alternative interpretations. Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, an outstanding philosopher and reformer of the 15th century, agreed that the donation could be a forgery, but argued that papal power had deeper foundations than historical documents. What strategy did church apologists choose to defend papal claims? The most talented among them focused not on refuting Valla's specific arguments, but on developing new theoretical justifications for papal authority. They argued that the pontiff's authority was based not on historical precedent, but on divine institution, transmitted through apostolic succession from St. Peter. Roberto Bellarmino, a Jesuit and prominent ecclesiastical polemicist of the 16th century, developed the doctrine of the Pope's indirect power in secular affairs. According to this theory, the pontiff does not have direct jurisdiction over temporal rulers, but may intervene in their activities if they affect the spiritual interests of the Church. This concept allowed papal claims to be maintained without relying on the discredited donation. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, responding to the challenges of the Reformation, cautiously sidestepped the question of Constantine's donation. The Council Fathers concentrated on the theological justification of papal primacy, avoiding references to historical documents of dubious authenticity. This was a tacit acknowledgement of the validity of humanist criticism. Paradoxically, Protestant reformers used Vala's work much more actively than its author. Martin Luther included the treatise on the donation in a collection of documents denouncing Roman tyranny. Jean Calvin and other Protestant theologians regularly referred to the exposure of the forgery as proof of the corruption of the papal system. How did Catholic historians' attitudes toward Constantine's donation change in subsequent centuries? Gradually, even church authors began to recognize the document's falsity. Caesar Baronius, compiler of the monumental ecclesiastical annals at the end of the 16th century, cautiously expressed doubts about the authenticity of the donation, although he did not dare to categorically reject it. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Catholic scholars increasingly openly acknowledged Vala's correctness. Jean Mabillon and other Bollandists, specialists in the study of the lives of saints, applied to ecclesiastical sources the same critical methods that had been developed by Italian humanists. Scientific objectivity gradually prevailed over confessional bias. The final official recognition of the forgery of the donation did not occur until the 19th century. Pope Pius IX, in his encyclical Quanta Cura, 1864, indirectly acknowledged that the Church no longer relied on this document to justify its rights. The era of Constantine's donation had finally come to an end. Contemporary Catholic historiography fully recognizes Vala's conclusions about the forgery of the donation. Church historians regard this document as an interesting monument to medieval ideology, but nothing more. Papal authority today is based exclusively on theological arguments, without reference to dubious historical precedents. Thus, the exposure of Constantine's donation became one of the first victories of the scientific method over religious dogmatism. This episode showed that no authority can withstand objective analysis of sources if it is carried out using the correct methodological principles. The consequences of the exposure of Constantine's donation for European politics were enormous, although they did not manifest themselves immediately. The loss of this key ideological weapon of the papacy gradually changed the balance of power between ecclesiastical and secular authorities in Europe, contributed to the rise of nation-states, and laid the foundations for the modern system of international relations based on the principle of sovereignty. Why did the political consequences of the exposure not manifest themselves immediately? The inertia of medieval political thinking was so strong that even scientific refutation of the donation could not instantly change the established system of relations. Secular rulers continued to take the Pope's opinion on political issues into account, even though the theoretical basis for his intervention had been undermined. The French kings were the first to reap the benefits of Vala's work. Already at the end of the 15th century, Louis XI referred to the falsity of the donation in disputes with Pope Sixtus IV over the boundaries of royal and ecclesiastical jurisdiction. The French monarchy actively used humanistic criticism to justify its independence from papal interference. Gallicanism gained a powerful intellectual weapon. The exposure of the donation played a particularly important role during the Reformation. Protestant rulers obtained a scientific justification for refusing to recognize papal supremacy. Henry VIII of England regularly referred to Vala's work in his disputes with Rome over the right to divorce and ecclesiastical jurisdiction. The Anglican Reformation would have been impossible without the prior undermining of the ideological foundations of papal power. The German princes who supported Luther also actively used arguments against the authenticity of the donation. Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony, who defended the great reformer, repeatedly pointed out to Emperor Charles V that the papal claims had no historical basis. This facilitated political opposition to the Reformation movement. What impact did the exposé have on the development of the theory of state sovereignty? Jean Bodin, in his 6 Books of the Commonwealth, 1576, directly referred to Valla's work, arguing that no one can stand above a sovereign ruler. The lack of historical grounds for papal supremacy became one of the arguments in favor of the absolute power of the monarch. The Peace of Westphalia of 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War, effectively enshrined the principle of state sovereignty in international law. Although Constantine's donation was not directly mentioned in the treaties, its exposure played an important role in shaping new ideas about international relations. The era of papal arbitration in European politics came to an end. The Italian states, traditionally most susceptible to papal influence, also gradually emancipated themselves from ecclesiastical control. In the 16th century, the Venetian Republic openly opposed papal claims, citing the lack of historical grounds for church interference in secular affairs. Pope Paul V's interdict failed to break the Venetians' resistance. How did the role of the papacy in European diplomacy change after the exposure of the donation? The pontiffs were forced to seek new forms of political influence. Instead of direct claims to supremacy, they began to act as mediators and arbitrators, relying on moral authority rather than historical precedents. Papal diplomacy became more subtle and flexible. The Holy Roman Empire, which nominally maintained ties with the papacy through the coronation ceremony, effectively became a secular state. The last emperors rarely turned to the Pope for legitimization of their power, preferring to rely on dynastic rights and the support of the electors. Constantine's donation no longer served as the symbolic basis of imperial power. The colonial expansion of European powers also took place without significant papal involvement. Although the pontiffs continued to sanction missionary activity, they no longer claimed a share of the newly discovered lands among Christian rulers. Alexander VI's bulls on the division of the New World remained the last manifestation of medieval ideas about papal power over the world. The French Revolution of 1789 finally put an end to the remnants of the medieval system. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen proclaimed the principle of popular sovereignty, excluding any form of external interference in the affairs of the state. Constantine's donation became a thing of history, not political practice. The Napoleonic Wars completed the process of secularization of European politics. The Concordat of 1800 defined the relationship between the French state and the Catholic Church on the principles of mutual respect for sovereignty, rather than medieval subordination. The era that began with the coronation of Charlemagne had finally come to an end. The modern system of international law is based entirely on the principle of the sovereign equality of states, which would have been impossible without the prior destruction of medieval ideas about papal supremacy. Lorenzo Valla's work thus became one of the cornerstones of the modern world order. The story of Constantine's donation became one of the most instructive lessons on how the desire for power can distort historical truth, and how the scientific method can expose even the most sophisticated falsifications. This 1,000-year-old hoax demonstrated the power of the written word in political struggle, and showed that no authority can withstand objective analysis of sources for long. What methods were used to create and maintain this grandiose forgery? An analysis of the history of the donation shows that successful falsification requires not only skillful imitation of the style of the era, but also the creation of a whole system of supporting documents and traditions. The donation did not appear in isolation. It was part of a large complex of forged texts, including the pseudo-Isidore's decretals and various lives of saints. The timing of its appearance played a key role in establishing the forgery. The 8th century was a period of political instability in Italy. when the papacy was in dire need of ideological arguments to justify its independence. In conditions of limited literacy and the absence of developed methods of source criticism, a forged document could easily be mistaken for a genuine one. The sociological aspect of the history of the donation is no less instructive. The document gained recognition not only because it was skillfully composed, but also because it met the needs of the era. Medieval society needed a stable system of power, and the idea of papal supremacy provided such a system. People believed in the donation, not only because they could not refute it, but also because they wanted to believe. Why did it take almost 1,000 years to expose the forgery? The reasons lay not only in the imperfection of medieval methods of studying sources, but also in the peculiarities of medieval thinking. For the people of that time, it was not the literal authenticity of the document that was important, but its conformity to established ideas about the proper order of things. The exposure of the donation was only made possible by fundamental changes in the intellectual culture of the Renaissance. Humanists developed new criteria for truth based on philological analysis and historical criticism. They placed scientific objectivity above religious authority and political expediency. What lessons does the history of the donation teach us about the nature of historical knowledge? This case shows that historical truth is not self-evident, but requires constant effort to verify and re-verify sources. No document, however authoritative it may seem, should be taken at face value without critical analysis. Contemporary historiography owes much to the work of Lorenzo Valla. His methods formed the basis of textual criticism, diplomatics, and other auxiliary historical disciplines. The principle of critical verification of sources, first consistently applied by the Italian humanist, became the foundation of scientific history. The history of the donation also demonstrates the importance of an interdisciplinary approach to studying the past. Valla combined philological analysis with historical knowledge and logical criticism, creating a comprehensive research methodology. Modern science continues to develop this approach, drawing on data from archaeology, paleography, chemical analysis, and other disciplines. What is the significance of the exposure of the donation for the modern world? In an era of information wars and fake news, the story of Constantine's donation takes on particular relevance. It shows how powerful false information can be when it comes from authoritative sources and meets the expectations of the audience. The political lessons of the donation story also remain relevant. The document showed how ideological constructs can influence real politics, creating systems of power that seem unshakable but are in fact based on false premises. The exposure of the forgery contributed to the emergence of modern ideas about state sovereignty and international law. The intellectual honesty demonstrated by Lorenzo Valla remains a model for scholars of all disciplines. The Italian humanist risked conflict with powerful political and religious forces for the sake of scientific truth. His example shows that true science is impossible without a willingness to follow the facts wherever they lead. The story of Constantine's donation ends, but its lessons remain relevant. In a world where information is becoming an increasingly important resource of power, critical thinking and scientific methodology are of particular importance. Lorenzo Valla's legacy lives on in every honest researcher who prefers uncomfortable truth to convenient lies. The greatest forgery of the Middle Ages has been exposed, but the struggle for historical truth continues. Each new generation of historians must re-examine the conclusions of their predecessors, refine research methods, and defend the principles of scientific objectivity. Only in this way can we ensure that no new hoax will be able to survive for 1,000 years.